He doesn't suspect a thing. It's almost too easy, my wife bragged with her lover. I transferred everything to an irrevocable trust. 6 months later, she begged me. I never thought I'd be writing this kind of post, but here we are. At 37, I've spent the last decade building my financial advisory firm from nothing into something substantial. I've worked 60-hour weeks, sacrificed weekends, and pushed through burnout episodes to create a life I thought we both wanted. I say we because for 8 years, I was married to Jane, a woman I believed was my partner in everything. I never imagined the person who vowed to stand by me would secretly plot to financially destroy me, but that's exactly what happened. Jane and I met at a charity gala 9 years ago. She was vibrant, intelligent, and ambitious, working as a marketing coordinator for a local firm. Our connection was immediate, and within a year, we were married. The first few years were everything I'd hoped for in a marriage. We traveled, we built our home together, and we supported each other's dreams. At least, that's what I thought was happening. As my business grew more successful, our financial situation improved dramatically. We moved from a modest apartment to a beautiful house in an upscale neighborhood. We took luxury vacations. We had investment accounts, vacation property, and all the trappings of success. Throughout this journey, I was the primary breadwinner. Jane had switched jobs several times but never seemed to find her passion. Eventually, she settled into a part-time role that gave her flexibility but contributed minimally to our household income. I never complained. I was proud to provide for us and happy to see her pursuing what made her happy. Looking back, I can pinpoint when things started to change. It was about 2 years ago when my business crossed the 7-figure revenue mark. Jane's attitude shifted subtly at first. She became more interested in our finances, asking detailed questions about our investments and assets, questions she'd never cared about before. I was actually pleased, thinking she was finally taking an interest in our financial future. Then came the other changes. The password on her phone changed. Her phone was always face down when not in use. She started working late despite her part-time schedule. New clothes appeared in her closet. She paid more attention to her appearance, but showed less interest in intimacy with me. When we did talk, she'd find ways to criticize me, my work hours, my focus on the business, even how I loaded the dishwasher. I initially chalked it up to a rough patch or her feeling unfulfilled professionally. I suggested therapy, both couples and individual. She dismissed the idea, saying there was nothing wrong that couldn't be fixed by me being more present. The irony of that statement would become painfully clear later. The financial red flags became more obvious. Jane started insisting she needed to be added to all my accounts for security purposes. She suggested we consolidate our finances to simplify things. She asked about the equity in our home and the valuation of my business. She wanted to know about my retirement accounts and life insurance policies. Each question seemed reasonable in isolation, but together, they formed a pattern I was too blind to see. My first glimpse into what was really happening came in fragments. One evening, I was looking for our tax documents on our shared home computer when a notification popped up from Jane's email. The preview showed only a snippet. Consultation next Tuesday at 2 p.m. Please bring any financial. The rest was cut off. It seemed odd. Jane had never shown interest in financial planning before, but I dismissed it, thinking perhaps she was finally taking initiative with her own finances. A week later, I noticed Jane had left her phone on the kitchen counter while showering. A text notification appeared from someone listed simply as J. All I could see was, "Can't wait to see you tomorrow." Remembered to ask him about the message cut off there. Something about the secretive tone made my stomach tight, but I told myself I was being paranoid. Small inconsistencies began accumulating. Jane claimed to be working late, but her office lights were dark when I drove by one evening to surprise her with dinner. Her browser history showed searches for average divorce settlement before being quickly cleared. A call came to our home phone from a law office asking for her to confirm an appointment. Each incident seemed explainable in isolation, but together, they formed a pattern I couldn't ignore. After weeks of growing suspicion, I finally crossed a line I never thought I would. While Jane was meeting friends for brunch, I checked her laptop, which she'd left logged in. Her email revealed a consultation appointment with a family law attorney specializing in high-asset divorces. There were searches for how to document husband's assets before divorce and hidden money in business valuation. My hands trembled as I scrolled through her search history, finding queries like divorce assets split our estate and how to get best settlement in divorce. I told myself there must be an explanation, that I was misinterpreting something. Then I found a draft email to someone named Jake, never sent but saved in her drafts folder. It contained vague references to our plan and waiting for the right time, alongside complaints about me being absorbed in the business and how she deserved more. This discovery led me to dig deeper, though I felt sick doing it. I installed recovery software on our shared computer and recovered deleted messages between Jane and Jay. The fragments I pieced together painted a disturbing picture. "He doesn't suspect anything," one recovered message from Jane read. "Just keeps working while I gather what I need." A partially recovered response: "Patience will pay off. My cousin got half her ex's business in there." Over several weeks, I gathered more evidence, each piece more damning than the last. Eventually, I found an email thread with her attorney discussing the value of my business. Based on current valuation methods, the attorney wrote, "We can make a strong case for 50% ownership interest plus additional support based on your contributions to his success." Jane's reply chilled me. "Perfect. I've been copying financial documents whenever I can. He thinks I'm just taking an interest in our future." I felt physically ill reading their exchange. 8 years of marriage reduced to a financial extraction plan. The woman I'd loved and trusted was systematically preparing to blindside me, take half my life's work, and start over with her affair partner. I couldn't sleep that night or the next as I cycled through shock, disbelief, rage, and heartbreak. After 3 days of internal turmoil, I made a decision. I wouldn't confront Jane yet. Tipping my hand would only cause her to accelerate her plans or become more careful. Instead, I needed to protect myself legally first. I discreetly met with the top 3 divorce attorneys in our city for consultations, effectively conflicting them out from representing Jane. The attorney I selected, Patricia, was known for her tough approach to high-asset divorces. When I showed her the evidence I'd gathered, she nodded grimly. "Unfortunately, this isn't uncommon," she said, "but you have an advantage. You know what's coming, and she doesn't know that you know. That gives us time to prepare." Patricia explained that in our state, while most assets acquired during marriage would be considered marital property subject to division, there were legal strategies to protect my business and investments. The key was acting before Jane filed for divorce. Over the next 2 months, I executed a careful plan under Patricia's guidance. First, I created an irrevocable trust with my mother as trustee. This was completely legal as long as it was done without the specific intent to defraud a spouse in an imminent divorce. Since Jane hadn't filed yet and I had legitimate estate planning reasons for creating the trust, we were in the clear. I transferred ownership of my business to the trust along with our investment accounts and vacation property. The house remained in both our names, as changing that would have immediately alerted Jane. I also began documenting every aspect of her behavior: the late nights, the secretive phone calls, the sudden interest in our finances. I hired a private investigator who documented her meetings with Jake, providing photographs and surveillance reports that confirmed their affair. Throughout this process, I maintained a facade of normalcy at home. I continued to work my usual hours, didn't change my spending habits, and even planned a weekend getaway with Jane that she reluctantly agreed to, likely to avoid suspicion. The emotional toll was immense, smiling at the woman who was actively plotting to destroy me financially, pretending I didn't know about her betrayal. But I knew I had to play the long game. 3 months after I discovered her plan, it finally happened. I arrived home to find a process server waiting with divorce papers. Jane had moved most of her personal belongings out while I was at work and left a note saying she needed space, and her lawyer would be in contact. The divorce complaint demanded half of all marital assets, alimony, exclusive use of our home, and a 50% interest in my business. It claimed she had sacrificed her career to support my entrepreneurial endeavors. A stunning revision of history, considering her part-time work schedule and multiple job changes had been entirely her choice. I called Patricia immediately, and we set our counter-strategy in motion. 2 weeks later, we had our first 4-way meeting with Jane and her attorney, a sharply dressed man with a reputation for aggressive tactics. As we sat in the conference room of his downtown office, I maintained a neutral expression while Jane avoided my gaze. Her attorney opened with a rehearsed speech about Jane's contributions to my success and her entitlement to a substantial settlement. Patricia let him finish before calmly sliding a folder across the table. Before we proceed further, you should be aware of these documents. They outline the current ownership structure of my client's assets. The attorney opened the folder, and I watched his expression change as he reviewed the trust documents. He whispered something to Jane, whose face drained of color. "This is outrageous," he finally sputtered. "Your client transferred virtually all marital assets to a trust right before the divorce filing. This is clearly an attempt to defraud my client of her rightful share." Patricia smiled thinly. "Actually, these transfers were completed 3 months ago as part of my client's estate planning process, well before your client consulted with you or filed for divorce. There was no intent to defraud, merely prudent financial management. And as you can see from the documentation, everything was done in accordance with state law." Jane's attorney argued that the timing was suspicious, but Patricia calmly pointed out that without evidence of my knowledge of Jane's divorce plans, the transfers would likely stand up in court. Then she pulled out another folder. "Additionally, we have substantial evidence of your client's infidelity and her communications explicitly plotting to maximize her financial gain through divorce. I believe the judge would find these text messages between your client and Mr. Jake Peterson particularly interesting." Jane gasped, finally looking directly at me. "You went through my phone. How dare you invade my privacy?" "It was the only time I broke my silence during the meeting. Privacy? You were planning to take half of everything I've worked for while sleeping with your colleague. You don't get to talk about invasion of privacy." The meeting deteriorated quickly after that. Jane's attorney requested a brief recess, during which I could hear her yelling at him in a nearby conference room. When they returned, her attorney adopted a more conciliatory tone, suggesting we find middle ground. Patricia firmly stated that given the circumstances, my position was simple. Jane would receive only what she had brought into the marriage, which was minimal. As we left the meeting, Jane followed me to the elevator, her composed facade completely crumbled. "How could you do this?" she hissed, tears streaming down her face. "You've left me with nothing." I looked at her, this stranger wearing my wife's face, and felt a strange calm. "I didn't do this, Jane." "You did. I just found out in time to protect myself." "This isn't over," she threatened as the elevator doors closed between us. She was right about that, but not in the way she intended. The aftermath was messy and public. Jake disappeared from the picture as soon as he realized there would be no financial windfall. Mutual friends took sides as the details emerged, most expressing shock at Jane's calculated betrayal. Her own parents, who had always treated me like a son, couldn't look her in the eye when they learned the truth. Jane's lawyer tried various legal maneuvers to invalidate the trust, but the timing and documentation were on my side. The fact that I had substantial evidence of her affair and conspiracy further weakened her position. After 6 more months of legal wrangling, she finally accepted a settlement that gave her a small cash payment and her personal possessions, but nothing else. The day our divorce was finalized, I felt no triumph, only exhaustion and relief that the nightmare was ending. The 10-month battle had taken its toll on my health, my business, and my ability to trust. I sold our house, too many painful memories, and moved into a downtown loft. I refocused on my business, which had suffered during the divorce proceedings, and slowly began rebuilding my life. 3 months after the divorce, Jane reached out through a mutual friend asking to meet for coffee to talk. I declined. 2 weeks later, she appeared unannounced at my office looking nothing like the polished, confident woman I'd married. Her appearance was more subdued, her designer clothes replaced with simpler attire, her demeanor lacking the self-assurance I'd always known. "Please, just 5 minutes," she said when my assistant tried to turn her away. Against my better judgment, I agreed to see her. As she sat across from me in my office, I noticed how much the ordeal had aged her too. The calculating woman from the legal proceedings was gone, replaced by someone who seemed smaller somehow. "I know I'm the last person you want to see," she began, voice quavering, "but I needed to tell you face to face how sorry I am. I was wrong, so terribly wrong." I remained silent, waiting for what I suspected would come next. She didn't disappoint. "Jake wasn't who I thought he was," she continued, tears forming. "He had all these ideas about what we deserved. how we were both undervalued. He convinced me that you didn't appreciate me, that I was entitled to more. She looked down at her hands. He made it sound reasonable, even righteous, but it was all manipulation. Once he realized there wouldn't be a big payout, he lost interest. I watched her carefully, noting how she shifted responsibility to Jake while positioning herself as another victim. Classic Jane, even her apology contained a deflection of blame. I was vulnerable and confused. She pressed on seeing my skepticism. My career wasn't going anywhere, and watching your success made me feel inadequate. Jake exploited that. He preyed on my insecurities. Her voice dropped to a whisper. The things he suggested, the plans we made, that wasn't really me. I got caught up in something ugly, but I've had time to reflect. I'm in therapy now, working through why I made such terrible choices. She reached across the desk, trying to touch my hand. I pulled back instinctively. We had 8 good years, she said earnestly. That has to count for something. People make mistakes, even terrible ones, but they can change. I've changed. Maybe not right away, but eventually. We could try again, start slowly rebuilding trust. For a brief moment, I remembered the woman I thought I'd married, her laugh, her ambition, the future we'd planned. But that woman had never really existed. What sat before me was someone who had meticulously plotted to take everything I'd built, and who was now, having failed, trying a different approach to regain the lifestyle she'd lost. Jane, I said finally, I appreciate you coming here and saying these things truly, but there's something you need to understand. I paused, choosing my words carefully. Even if Jake influenced you, and I'm not saying he didn't, you still made your choices. You still violated my trust in the most fundamental way possible. That's not something therapy or time can fix. Her face fell. So you can't forgive me after all we shared? Forgiveness isn't the issue, I replied. I hope I can forgive you someday for my own peace of mind, but trust is like glass once it's shattered. You can't put it back together without seeing the cracks. We can't go back. You don't mean that, she said, desperation creeping into her voice. You're just hurt. We can start fresh. I could help with the business again. I still know your clients, your processes. No one understands your vision like I do. And there it was, the real reason for her visit, not just reconciliation, but access to the business and lifestyle she'd lost. I stood up, signaling the end of our conversation. I wish you well, Jane. I truly do, but please don't contact me again. Her expression hardened momentarily, that calculating look flickering across her face before she composed herself. You'll change your mind, she said, gathering her purse. When the loneliness sets in, when you realize what we had, I'll be waiting. It's been a year since that conversation, and I'm finally starting to feel like myself again. I've dated casually, but find it difficult to trust fully. I'm working with a therapist to process the betrayal and learn to be vulnerable again. My business has recovered and is thriving, and I've developed a closer relationship with my family who supported me throughout the ordeal. Through mutual connections, I've heard that Jane struggled initially, financially, and professionally. She moved to a much smaller apartment and cycled through several jobs. There was a brief reconciliation with Jake that predictably imploded. For a while, she told anyone who would listen that I had manipulated the legal system and left her destitute. But those stories gained little traction given the evidence that had emerged during our proceedings. Most recently, I heard she's relocated to another state and secured a marketing position with a mid-sized company. I feel no satisfaction in her difficulties, only a distant sadness for what could have been if she'd made different choices. The experience has left me wiser, if somewhat more cautious. I've learned to trust my instincts when something feels wrong and to protect myself without apology. I've also learned that sometimes the person who knows you best can hurt you most, but only if you give them the power to do so. For anyone reading this who sees familiar patterns in their own relationship, my advice is simple. Pay attention to the red flags, document everything, and consult a good attorney sooner rather than later. It's better to be paranoid and wrong than trusting and blindsided. Trust should be earned continuously, not given blindly based on vows spoken years ago. And if you find that trust broken beyond repair, remember that protecting yourself isn't selfish. It's necessary. Life continues to move forward. My business has expanded to 2 additional locations, and I promoted 2 key employees to partnership positions with proper contracts and protections in place, of course. The experience with Jane taught me valuable lessons about both personal and professional relationships. I've started seeing someone new, a corporate attorney named Melissa who I met at a business conference. The relationship is progressing slowly as we're both cautious people with established lives and careers. She knows my story and understands my trust issues. More importantly, she respects the boundaries I've established as I continue to heal. As for Jane, I heard she finally secured a stable job at a marketing agency in a city about 3 hours away. According to mutual friends, she's been open about her mistakes and seems to be doing the work to understand why she made such destructive choices. I wish her well from a distance, but that chapter of my life remains firmly closed. The trust I established during the divorce proceedings continues to hold most of my assets, though I've made arrangements to gradually transition some properties back into my name over time. My attorney assures me that enough time has passed that these moves won't raise any legal issues. The pain doesn't disappear completely, but it does fade. What remains is a clearer perspective on what matters in life: integrity, authentic connections, and inner peace. I lost a marriage I thought was solid, but I saved myself from a future built on lies. In the end, that's the victory that matters most.